Welcome to the Social Movements Lab. My name is Michael Hardt. I'm co-host of the lab with Sandro and Mezzadra. I'm in Seattle, Washington. Sandro is in Bologna, Italy. And today we have prepared a dialogue about struggles over student debt and student poverty with a principal discussion with Andrew Ross, who's in New York City. And then we'll join the discussion later, Marie-Laure Basilien-Gainche, who's in Lyon, France, and Niccolò Cuppini, who is in Bologna, Italy. Yeah, excuse me. The purpose of the lab is to investigate the nature of contemporary social movements and the relationships among them. And we started the lab, Sandro and I, 3 years ago. Well, for 3 years, it functioned at Duke University at the Humanities Center there, the Franklin Humanities Institute, in an academic context. For the last 6 months, we have relaunched the lab in a more public format with the aid of Red May. In fact, I would recommend, if you're interested in these kinds of discussions, check out the Red May YouTube channel and the Red May website, which of course in May will provide, as they say each year, a vacation from capitalism. That's their promise. I'd also like to thank, before we get started, our media partners, Dinamopress and EuroNomade in Italy. Our standard practice with the lab, in order really to emphasize the connections, is to proceed along 3 axes of discussion. Not that we confront them exactly directly, but it's a standard practice for approaching each movement, to ask these 3 axes, the connections, the genealogical connections, like where did a struggle, what connections, historical connections paved the way for this current struggle, so the genealogical ones. Transversal connections, what are connections to other movements within the same space, connections, say, between feminist struggles and race struggles, or the potential for such transversal connections. And third, the international connections with similar movements. So I just pose that as a general framework, partly because we bring it each time. It's a way for us, I think, of trying to take stock of not only the nature of each movement, but the existing and potential connections among movements. So in order to begin our discussion today, I should pass to Sandro, who has we agreed would start this discussion. Sandro.
Thank you, Michael. And I would like to welcome Andrew. We are really happy to have you with us today. Andrew Ross has been engaged for several years now in the student debt movement, and particularly the kind of connection between the Occupy movement and organizing around student debt. He has written extensively about such topics. And maybe today can be the occasion take stock of the development of the debt resistance movement, also in the light of the pandemic and the kind of transformations that are announced in the field of higher education in the US as well as elsewhere in the world, including Europe. So the floor is yours.
And Andrew, could you, because many listeners will not know much of the history of the debt resistance movement, yes, as Sandro said, starting from Occupy, could you first give us even some general understanding, especially for people outside the US, of what student debt looks like in the US?
Sure. No, yes, of course. Well, first of all, thank you for setting up this conversation. It's and also actually for holding out the promise of a vacation from capitalism. That's a very attractive prospect at this point in time. But I especially appreciate the focus in social movements because it really has been movement work that has been driving the conversation in the US, at least, this conversation about education debt. And let's first establish that the US is an outlier on this landscape. It's exceptional because no other country has so systematically turned their higher education system into a vehicle for profit taking and profit making. And there are many entities that take a cut from that process, including the federal government. It's not well understood that the federal government in the US makes a massive profit from its student lending operation, tens of billions of dollars annually in sheer profit. And for a lot of folks, that's difficult to get their minds around that, government actually playing a predatory role in extracting profit from this business in common with other actors. So the US is far out in front in that regard. For myself, I've been involved in the debt resistance movement for almost 10 years now. And I've never had any student debt myself because I went to college in Scotland where universities are free. In fact, in those days, the government actually gave us money to go to college as a stipend. And the universities still are free in Scotland, unlike in England. And that's the way it should be. I mean, the bulk of the population agree, there's a consensus that that's the way it should be. And they hold their politicians accountable to that. So it continues to be the case, as in many other countries, as we know, that they have a tuition-free system. And the question of how affluent a country is not a huge consideration here. We go south of the border to Mexico where universities are free. They're perfectly good universities. Mexico has made a decision politically to maintain that. So there's absolutely no reason why in the US, the most affluent country in the world, we can't achieve access to higher education in a tuition-free manner. So I didn't enter the movement as a student debtor, although there are many people my age who are student debtors because there's been a big generational shift in the burden of student debt. And we can talk about that. That's an aspect of the poverty theme that we're addressing here. But I did enter as an educator. And Occupy Wall Street gave us permission, many of us permission to enter this field because student debt was one of the leading sources of resentment, the student debt burden. We formed the Occupy Student Debt Campaign very early on in Occupy, which had a very ambitious goal of doing a national debt strike. It was a pretty crazy idea at that point in time, very marginal, but in those days in Occupy, everything seemed possible. It's a very heady moment. And we wanted 1 million student debtors to pledge to resist and default in their debts after 1 million had signed up. We didn't have the resources to run that campaign nationally. We got nowhere near 1 million pledgers, but we managed to raise the issue into public consciousness over the course of a year. And we learned a lot about student debt and the psychology of debtors, which is very important. And we learned a lot about organizing debtors, which ain't easy. Certainly not as easy as organizing workers, and that is not easy either. When our campaign ran down, our sort of eroded and fell apart, we realized that 1 million student debtors had actually defaulted that year, and they continue to do so every year. They just do it individually. So it has no political impact. If they'd done it all together, as we had imagined, we would be having a different conversation today for sure. The next organization we formed was called Strike Debt, and remnants of Occupy came together in Strike Debt. Strike Debt was more focused on household debt including medical debt and housing debt and credit card debt. Because our perception was that in any one household, all of these debts are interdependent. And it's important to use the household as a unit of analysis rather than silo off very particular debt classes. Two things we did in strike debt, which had a legacy. One was we produced something called the Debt Resistors Operations Manual, which was, we tried to write that in plain language, not the language of finance, because the language of finance is intentionally obscure and confusing. And that is still being used. You can still download it from the Strike Debt website. And we also launched something called the Rolling Jubilee, which was a very ambitious mutual aid project to raise money and buy debt on the secondary debt market and then abolish it. And it was mostly a public education project because not many people know about the secondary debt market. We didn't know about it before we did it, but it turns out that non-performing loans are sold for pennies on the dollar on the secondary debt market. Debt collectors buy those debts and then try to recover the full amount of the debt. So we raised about $750,000 and abolished over $33 million worth of debt. It's a drop in the ocean, but it was a highly successful public exercise in political education. And also for people who learned about it, when the debt collector calls them up, you have a different conversation on the phone with the debt collector if you know that they've bought your debt for a few cents on the dollar. After the Rolling Jubilee, strike debt also fell apart for all sorts of movement reasons. And we formed a much smaller group called the Debt Collective, which is still active today and is scaling up and building up in all sorts of ways. The Debt Collective started from the ground up, organizing a small group of student debtors, again, into the first debtors union. And they went on strike. We organized a series of legal claim-making process on the federal government to have loans discharged that were incurred under fraudulent circumstances. And we got about $1.3 billion worth of debt relief through that operation. It hasn't all been paid out yet because the Trump administration's Secretary of Education blocked a lot of it, but we feel it will be paid out over time. And more recently, we've launched another debt strike called the Biden 100 Jubilee, which is targeted directly at Joe Biden's administration and is putting pressure on Sleepy Joe to actually enact some serious debt abolition, and also to enact college for all legislation, which will make our universities tuition free. So that's a kind of thumbnail version of the movement groups and work that I've been involved in. There are others, but I can only speak about the work that we've done. If you'd like me to elaborate on any of those points, I'm happy.
How do you see the outlook of the movement in the present conjuncture? Particularly looking at the way in which higher education is kind of changing in the US, if this is the case.
Well, Sandro, we've gone from being a very marginal voice, not taken seriously at all when it comes to debt abolition and also tuition-free college. We've moved really to becoming a mainstream position. Most of the presidential candidates on the Democrat side in the recent election had some version of these topics and goals on their agenda, and their campaign agenda. And right now, at least, it's still amazing to us, but right now, the prospect of some kind of large-scale debt abolition on the part of the administration is on the front burner. It's the movement groups that have put it there, it should be said. Joe Biden is one of the most, is a very solid and reliable friend of Wall Street. That's his political career. It's he's in a great deal of agony over this decision, whether to abolish debt or not, because it would, in effect, actually be the first time that the federal government in the U.S. has ever abolished a big chunk of household debt. And even if he moved on a very small amount, it would still be significant in that regard, because it completely goes against the grain of fundamental principles of Wall Street, that you have to pay back your debts no matter what. And so it really would be a big crack in the wall if that were to happen. Now, that said, it's only happening, we believe, because of economic pragmatism. It doesn't happen in the US, and I think this is the case with most in the Anglosphere, most of the Anglo-Saxon settler states. These kinds of movements, these kinds of progressive moves are made out of economic pragmatism, as opposed to, what is more common in Europe, I think, which is recognizing, social and moral rights. However partially implemented those are, in the US and in the UK and other Anglosphere states, you always have to show the transactional, you always have to do the math. You have to reckon the costs and prove that this would be some kind of economic stimulus. And so that's what's happening right now. The prospect of a Jubilee is being advanced on the basis of it providing a big economic stimulus after the pandemic, as opposed to, this is the right thing to do. This is what our citizens need. So it's a somewhat confusing moment for us, having the goals in the mainstream, but being legitimized for reasons that we wouldn't necessarily choose. But we make history under conditions not of our making. So.
Andrew, I just wanted to pursue the the narrative you gave of becoming mainstream. So that in 2011, both of the demands for free university and abolishing debt seemed like you said, like a crazy idea. Now, 10 years later, it's been adopted, at least within large segments of the Democratic Party. And I wonder if you could, there's certain. I can think of certain instances where people tell that narrative in a negative key, like that the demands have been co-opted and tamped down or something like that, distorted. But I can also imagine telling that same narrative in a positive key, in some ways that it creates a new platform for struggling differently, or it's a kind of success. Yeah, how would you characterize it, or what's your feeling about the nature of this transformation and what started as being criticized as a crazy idea now seems like part of the mainstream?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on something that it's really about the psychology of any movement grouping, in a sense, and what you choose to do with respect, especially to state power, because in the brief history that I've been recounting, of course, in Occupy, no one wanted anything to do with state power at all. It was completely verboten to have any contact with representatives of the state, even NGOs, the nonprofit industrial complex, all of these avenues power were considered taboo. And so over the course of that 10 years, we have obviously, shifted that mentality. We still try to maintain a militant position by always taking the maximalist position. So instead of means testing of access to college, we insist and stand firm on the need for it to be a universal access program that is not means tested. We call for universal cancellation of all student debt, as opposed to $10,000 or $50,000, which are that's within the range of what's being considered right now. But at the same time, we have, in all sorts of ways, established lines of communication with staffers in Congress, and in some cases with representatives, especially the socialist representatives who we have now on Capitol Hill. So that's been an evolution. And in fact, currently, right now, we're providing input for the drafting of a new version of College for All legislation, which is going to be introduced by Jamila Prayapal in the House at the end of March, and also by Bernie Sanders in the Senate. So I wouldn't describe that as proximity to power, but it is obviously something that a lot of social movements have to agonize over, those decisions about the extent of their influence, or how to leverage their influence in corridors of power. And we have, we've obviously agonized over those decisions, and still do to some degree, but I think we crossed the Rubicon at a certain point, and transcended that taboo, the legacy of Occupy, of not speaking to the state and not involving the state. That said, I think I would describe our approach more as targeting state power, as opposed to leveraging state power. And that's why, the target right now is Joe Biden, of all people. He would probably be the last person in the Senate on Capitol Hill that you would be expecting to be faced with this decision. But history has placed him there, and we're putting him on the spot, as it were. Does that make sense, Michael?
Let me ask a last and more general question, keeping in mind the transversal connections mentioned by Michael at the beginning. You explained that the logic of debt has become further entrenched over the last years, and many social movements have addressed the question of that. I'm thinking, for instance, of Latin American feminists, but also of struggles for housing in Spain that are basically struggles against banks, against mortgages. Many people involved in organizing around that explain that there is often a kind of subjectivity problem, which means a guilty feeling that is connected with the very logic of that, as we know. So from this point of view, what are the lessons of the debt resistance movement in the US? What are the experiences, first of all?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sandro, and it does speak to the psychology of the debtor, and the stigmatizing and the shame and the guilt that a lot of people experience. And we've tried to transcend that, or bring people into a collective context in all sorts of ways. partly through the, you know, the ritual of coming out about your debt, which is a ritual within our movement. But also in showing that collective action can actually produce results. And, you know, we call that proof of concept. And we did that with the Rolling Jubilee, first of all, and then we did it with the for-profit college claims on the government. And now we've launched a larger version of a debtors union, because ultimately we feel that a debtors union is in the position not just of reinventing what a union is, but it's also in the position of responding to something which is inevitable in the 21st century. We think that debtors unions are as inevitable to our economic civilization in advanced countries in the 21st century as labor unions were inevitable at the height of industrialization in the 19th century. And I think we tend to see the debtors union in some ways as an extension of the labor movement, because debts are quite literally the wages of the future. I mean, when you sign a loan, you're promising the fruits of your labor in the future. Another way of thinking about this is to see debts as a form of wage theft, which is the way I prefer to look at it. So we feel that the debtors union is absolutely crucial. Organizing debtors, however, is very, very difficult, as I mentioned earlier. It's not like a workplace where workers tend to know one another and can more easily trust one another by stepping forward with collective action. Any particular group or family of debtors are not necessarily going to know one another. They may not even share the same creditor, given the frequency with which loans are sold on. And sometimes the actual holder of the credit is obscure at this point. So it's absolutely vital then to establish, you know, platforms. Our debt collective platform is engineered for members to get to know one another, and we do all sorts of political education seminars. I did one last night called a Jubilee School class. And as a way of socializing and establishing bonds of trust. And so that's the way forward. It's far from clear that will get any easier over time, but we do see it as necessary work. And we do have a track record of showing that collective action can produce results, because as an individual, you can always go in and renegotiate your debts. Creditor's door is always open to doing that, even for sovereign countries. You can go to the Club of Paris, which coordinates all these, you know, external debts. If you're a global South country, you can go to the Club of Paris and beg for your debts to be renegotiated, and there's a good chance they will be. But you can only do it alone. You can't do it with 2 or 3 other countries. That's a big no-no, and that's the #1 principle. And so the same goes for household debts, and that's what we're trying to turn around and show that it's actually possible and necessary.
This question for me, it seems really interesting, and I mean, I'm just underlining. It's really not asking anything more, Andrew, about it. The way of using household as the means of connection among different potentially separate struggles. You know, one's about, you know, evictions, and others about, you know, knocking out mortgages, health debt, etc. Being able to put them together or show the potential for coordination among them does seem to me like a very exciting and difficult process. I think it's probably a good time for us to, our idea now is to bring Marie-Laure and Niccolò into the conversation. as Andrew said before, the U.S. is an outlier in terms of especially quantitative terms about student debt and the cost of education. It of course doesn't mean that in France and Italy that university is free, as we know, but we thought that the pivot might be about the question about student poverty. You know, that from a US perspective, one might say, well, look, they pay so little, students have it great there. Like they must all be doing great. And so it might be a useful way of at least of introducing part of the discussion with either Niccolò or Marie-Laure. I guess I would ask you to volunteer to give sort of a view from how the question of student poverty and the potential for or existing resistances to that poverty are coordinated among students in Italy or France. Marie-Laure, why don't you begin?
Yeah, I can start because I just wanted to underscore how strange it seems for me when I hear all the experience and experimentations Andrew Ross explained. As far as in France, since 2007, the idea is to promote the American model for universities. So the idea since then from government to government is to reform the universities in order to promote the American model, even though there are some strange elements that are quite astonishing and concerning about the implementation of neoliberal management in the universities as well as in the hospitals, for instance. And I think what Andrew Ross exposed makes me think of Alain Supiot, La gouvernance par les nombres, his famous book about the governance by numbers, and all he says about how the government by people, the government by values, social rights, economic rights, human rights, is changed, is evolving with such neoliberal management to governance by numbers. So it's like a dehumanization of people and of public services that are not supposed to exist any longer. And that was like a first idea. Concerning the student poverty situation in France, in fact, I have to underscore that there are two separate organizations at the superior level in France. We have the universities that are not free. We have fees like 300 euros a year to 500 euros a year in a PhD student, like universities. And we have what we call grandes écoles. There are no high schools. There are like super huge mental superior schools for commerce, like HEC, l'ESSEC, commercial superior schools. You have like those for engineer, and they are not free. You have to pay. You have to pay like 10 to 4,000 euros a year to 20 or 30,000 euros a year. And we know that we have different population going for this different type of superior education system. The more fortunate people coming from the more fortunate families because of fundings, because of finance, because of intellectual, because of network are going to high superior schools. Yeah. But the less fortunate people, because of their finance, their fundings, their local situation, it's very expensive to go to a school in Paris. You have to pay 20,000 euros a year, and you have to pay for the renting an apartment and living in Paris, and the transport are very expensive, and the parents do not have the fundings to do so. So we have this dichotomy in the superior system. But concerning the university, when we can see mostly the precarity and poverty of the students, we can notice two types of precarity, two types of poverty. That is quite important since 20% of students of the 2.7 million towns that are going to universities in France are under the line, the poverty line. So it's quite a huge number of students in a very precarious and dire situations. I think that since the COVID-19 crisis, we can consider two trends. The first one is the deterioration of the socio-economic situation of students, because more than 50% of students in universities have to work to pay the university, the renting of their apartments, their food, and so forth. And with the COVID-19 sanitary situation, with the lockdown, all these students lost their job, and they were in the incapacity to bought the food they need. So we were facing at the university students that decided to rent the apartment, even the little room offered by the social service system of the universities that are quite expensive and that are quite well, they are deteriorated in a way that you can't imagine. And they decided to pay this rent, but not to eat. And we discovered we had to deliver them good food freely in order them to be able to sustain their lives. And we saw also girls that have the choice to buy food or sanitary products for their period. So it's quite amazing. We are like in the fifth most powerful country in the world, and our kids are not able to have the sanitary products they need or the food they need to eat. And we can see another trend. It is the deterioration of their global and mental health. And we discovered that they were not protected against disease. They are not able to go to the doctors. They are not able to be taken care in the hospitals because they are not considered as vulnerable people. And if they are vulnerable because they have some chronic disease, with the COVID-19, all the services that were supposed to deal with those chronic disease were shut down. So they were like abandoned by the system. And with the lockdown, with the curfews, with this Zoom live, Zoom be live, they have living with in their little room with only the company of their own screen. We have like, we know the syndrome de glissement. This is a mental disease that is well known. And we have the explosion of depression and suicide tentatives. And we do not have any response of our universities or our institutions. So what is striking is that the government is not doing anything about that. More than 2.7 million persons and their families. And it's quite shut down by some false problem like the Islamo-Gauchism at the university. For the social economic poverty, nothing has been done. It's only solidarity at the local level that with person that give their time, give their money to help those students. And for the global and mental health situation, the Minister of Superior Education promised 3 consultations with a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, with a shrink. But we do not have any elements to prove that this 3 sessions will be available for these students and how, with which psychiatrist, because we have a problem of psychiatrists in France. They are not enough to deal with all the pathologies, mental diseases. And here again, this is the voluntary solidarity of people that were gathered by some individual initiatives to let these students meet some psychologists on a free basis to be helped and to be extracted from this very dire situation in which they are. So what the last point I wanted to evoke is that this situation of the students, of their socio-economic situation, of their global and mental health situation, is the consequences of some neoliberal management of the public services in France since 2005. And what is astonishing and very upsetting for me is that the vulnerability of these students are the consequences of the choices of the government and the system. But the way to cope with this vulnerability is not to question the choices of the government, to question the way the system is addressed. In fact, the answer is, well, you are vulnerable, you need to go to a shrink. Well, you are not strong enough, tough enough to our society. And even we have people talking about the selection of the evolution. And I think it's so in contradiction with fundamental rights, human rights, that I am questioning the values of these rights in the actual society in France. And as I am thinking that our European identity is based upon such principles, legal principles of human rights, and how this situation, this pandemic is sweeping away all these principles, I'm very concerned about what is going on afterwards. As I said before, there is no possible social movements as gatherings are forbidden because of the state of health emergency. So we have like loneliness of all these students that the government and the institutions let them drown alone. So that's what I wanted to share about France situation.
I do. That's very interesting. Well, and upsetting, of course. But I do want to pursue a little bit later the possibilities or existence of mutual aid or potentials for resistance. But I think first, Niccolò, it'd be helpful to see your perspective on these same questions, and either in Italy or in Bologna specifically. How do you see the same situation?
So yeah, thanks for inviting me today for this discussion. I try to share with you some thoughts about what's going on within Italian universities. But to start, I would like to give you a couple of framings for a sort of genealogical understanding of what's going on today. So first of all, I think we need to understand that in 1999, it was approved the so-called Bologna process. That was an agreement signed in Bologna by the European Union, if you want, that started to somehow make more uniform the university system in Europe. And this was an important moment for starting a new transformation of the very nature of universities all around Europe and also in Italy. A second important moment is the aftermath of the global crisis of 2007 and 2008. In many European countries, started a new wave of reforms around universities that was somehow accompanied by quite radical struggles that took the universities as the core of the claims and of processes of reappropriation, if you want, of the university. I think about England, in which in 2010 there was a powerful university movement. I think of Greece, and I think also of Italy. In Italy, from 2008 to 2010, we had a quite powerful and radical movement that took the university as the terrain for expressing the need for rethinking the society as a whole. And it was a movement that was able to articulate massive demonstration, claims to rethink the universities, and also riots that occurred in that years. And we can say that somehow, unfortunately, that movement has been the last massive national movement in Italy. Of course, we cannot explore this issue, but since then there has been a scarcity of massive national movements, of general movements, if you want, in Italy, a part of many important but more specific struggles. So today, probably we are living a third moment of this historical periodization in the transformation of universities. Of course, the pandemic has been, if you want, the starting point of these new transformations of the institutions, of the university institutions. The pandemic has been a shocking moment for universities, probably more than what occurred in the US, I suppose, because the digitalizing process, and all the ways in which university work and live were probably a little bit, I don't know how to say it, but if you want, Italian universities were a little bit more radicated within a previous model, if you want. So we have assisted in the last year to an acceleration of some ways in which universities work. So this is a general framework of Italian university, and I think, I mean, for my perspective, in the next years, university can become again a terrain for new struggles and new experimentations of alternatives, of self-management, of knowledge production, but also we can think about universities as one of the poles of social reproduction that can be a sort of, again, a terrain for new social mobilization in the after COVID context, also because within the so-called recovery plan, which is this massive amount of money that the European Union has make available for new reforms, and within this flow of money, university is considered as one of the most significant point of reforms. So I think this can open up a field of opposition, but also for making new alternatives possible. So just to conclude, what I want to say about the question of impoverishment of a student is that I think we can say that there has been a parallel between the impoverishment of the middle class after the crisis of 2007 and 2008, and the impoverishment of the social composition of students. If at the beginning of the new millennium, universities could be still for some parts of students, of course, not for the generality, but for some parts of students, a sort of place where to live some years without working, but only for studying and experimenting themselves. So today, this this very idea of the university as a free space for studying basically doesn't exist anymore. So the really majority of students need to work, needs to get access to the university welfare to have the possibility to study. So this is the general situation, and this is another factor that makes me thinking about the possibility, at least, of universities as a new terrain for mobilization. So just, I think, not to confuse the thoughts and political possibility about how to think today is about the universities from a critical perspective.
Andrew, I get the sense that you were going to say something, but maybe not.
Well, I could, because I think both Marie-Laure and Niccolò brought up points that really intersect with this. I mean, on the one hand, what is becoming, prevailing mentality in education, which, we can call neoliberal, but you refer to as government by numbers, Marie-Laure, this quantitative transactional mentality, which sees education as a return on investment. And I think we see this all the time in our students, that they're approaching education in that transactional manner. And while as an educator myself, I regret that, I can't blame them given their circumstances and the conditions. On the other hand, we have to fight for that space that Niccolò, you referred to. That's that free thinking space. Because as an educator, again, if you ask me what I thought the ideal of my job is to produce active, free thinking citizens, citizens of the world. I don't mean US citizens. And even if you look at the transactional, if you hold the transactional mentality, if you hold its feet to the fire and say, let's look at the numbers, they don't add up. If you look at the number of jobs, for example, in the US workforce, and I bet it's not any different in Italy and France, if you look at the jobs in the US workforce that actually require a 4-year academic degree, it's less than 30%. And so do the math. I don't, at the top of my head, I don't know what percentage of the population graduates, but it's much higher than that in the US. So you have a real problem there, which some might call a mismatch between qualifications and jobs. Others a problem of supply and demand, but either way you look at it, more than half of the graduates in the US are in jobs, if they have jobs, for which they're overqualified. So the return on investment argument doesn't even, I mean, there's absolutely no empirical basis for it. So let's take it out of the picture. Let's take that transactional mentality out of the picture and fill the picture with our own ideals and goals. We have to do that. That's part of the fight, seems to me.
Marie-Laure, go ahead. You're muted still.
Yeah. Yes. You asked a question, Michael, to Niccolò, and I just wanted to answer this one for France because I think it's very important about social resistance. And we experienced in France since 2007 huge, massive, radical movements for the preservation of our ideal universities, free university, in order to educate active, free-thinking citizens. And we have Sauvons l'université, Sauvons la recherche, Nous sommes l'université et la recherche, huge movements, transdisciplinary actions, very innovative social activities in order to promote universities. But all this were collapsed when was declared the state of security emergency. And this was a way to put a veil on the universities of the problem of the education of students first, and of free thinking of citizens second. And we noticed afterwards the movement of Gilets jaunes and the way it was pressured by the police in order to disappear, how heavy the action of the police were. And it's very stunning in the way the government used that. And for the universities, especially, the law for the programmation of the research for the 10 years to come, which was very, very upsetting for all the research, scholar, academic, professors and assistants and students. The unanimity against it existed, has been adopted in December 2020 with an accelerated procedure under the state of health emergency. So there was no debate at the parliament about this. And afterwards, there have been some decrees, executive orders that have been adopted in order to implement that without any consultation with the university scholars, students, families, students, etc. And I think it's very invasive situation, and we can have something else. We have this organizational, institutional attack against the university, but we have also some attacks against the free thinking or critical thinking we can educate the students at the universities. At the moment, there is like a very odd attack against scholars concerning the Islamo-Gauchism, that is a disease that is allegedly widespread in French universities. And we have to make like a McCarthyism witch hit to make them disappear. But when we look at who all these people are, they are sociologists, lawyers, anthropologists, politicians that are critics against the government. So we have to question the way the free thinking of students and scholars is at stake at the moment in some European countries.
Sandro, I see you leaning in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my impression after this engaging conversation is that there is no ideal university to be defended, even in Europe. There is kind of struggle that we have to imagine for future potential movements on at least 3 fronts. And the first one is access to the university. The university is not free in Italy. Italy is one of the countries in Europe where access to the university is most expensive. But also when access is free, as for instance in Germany, you know, the conditions of access are problematic. Second front of potential struggle is the way in which universities are internally organized, which also means the way in which knowledge is produced and transmitted. And there is a lot to do, of course. But then I think there is also a third important front, which we can define in terms of the borders of the university. which means the relation between the university and the world. The way in which knowledge produced and transmitted within the university is placed in the world, works in the world. And of course, for us, it is very important, and it will be even more important in the future to claim spaces for critical thinking, for the formation of free, critical citizens of the world. But it will be also important to pay attention to the operationalization of knowledge produced in the university. We know that, let's say, neoliberal rhetoric emphasizes the fact that knowledge must be useful. It must be useful for business. We have to find other criteria. We have to invent other criteria and to impose them. My knowledge must be useful for illegal migrants trying to enter Europe, for instance. And this is a point that is very important for me, but I have to find a way to operationalize it. But anyway, these are just some thoughts for the future, and pick up on what Niccolò was saying with a bit of optimism, and we need a bit of optimism in these days. But
Sandro, I think those three are very helpful, and I'm wondering if in the third, your borders one, fits the potential for transversality that others have talked about before. When Andrew was talking about the very beginning about how the household can function as a kind of pivot or uniting things, but also when Niccolò suggested, I think in rather hopeful mode, that the university could be the point at which several struggles could coincide or converge. I'm thinking that maybe this borders point is the one where in your model, Sandro, where there's the potential for transversal connections among struggles. I mean, I guess that's the way I'm putting it, that the university might, this is what I understood from you, Niccolò, that is a kind of wish that the university could become the place where there is a convergence among different struggles in a similar way that Andrew was describing that around debt. I think, that the household debt can be a point at which there's a recognition of coordination. I realize in Marie-Laure, you were making that very clear, how the pandemic makes many things impossible. But perhaps for some of this, we have to hope for the time after the pandemic when these can start again.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing in response to Sandro's comments? Listening to what you said, Sandro, especially the third point. Where I teach, the only portion of NYU that is actually, there's two portions of NYU that are free. One is our campus in Abu Dhabi. The Abu Dhabi government pays for everything. That's a whole other ball of wax or can of worms. The other one is a prison education program that we started from the ground up. It's a bottom-up project, and we got money to do it from outside the university. And it's by far the best thing that's ever happened to me as a teacher, because I teach regularly there. And there's a real we offer a degree in the prison that we chose. And there's a continuum there between the prison and the university that's very solid at this point, and is providing a source of research for us, actually, about criminal justice debt. We have a big project going on about criminal justice debt, and our formerly incarcerated students are among the researchers. We train them to do the research. So for me, that really has opened up as a model for, you know, reaching beyond those borders and establishing an alternative continuum for the incarcerated, because usually the continuum is with their inner city neighborhoods. The prisons are extensions of the inner city neighborhoods. To see the university, and especially a university like NYU, on that continuum has been sort of mind-blowing for them and for those of us who teach and research in the program.
It's currently 5 minutes after the hour. We usually try to keep the discipline of an hour just to allow things to stop. But as often happens, the discussion has opened up a lot of things that I would love to pursue with other hours in the future. But already it's yeah, I'm really excited about the discussion, and I guess I just want to thank you all for it, and hope we can continue a similar discussion soon.
Thank you also from my side.
Thank you for inviting
Thank you
me.
to
Thank
everyone.
you so much.
Thank you. It's been very useful. Goodbye.